Unfortunately, as you said, Shireen paid the biggest price. She lost her life for press freedom. She was on her task, doing nothing wrong, just covering a story. And I know Shireen was working for Al Jazeera, and I know that they are having training programs for all their journalists who are covering stories from crisis or conflict places. So I'm sure she went through a well training and she was aware of the situation, and I'm sure she wasn't violating any law. She was just doing her job.
Journalists around the world need to unite and work together in order to maintain not only the freedom of the press and the freedom of speech, but also their human rights against the forces of darkness who don't want the world to know of their crimes. And in this context in particular, I mentioned the Israeli occupation government that killed 57 Palestinian journalists since 2000 and committed 7,400 violations against Palestinian and foreign journalists since 2013. To talk more about that, I have with me via Skype from Sarajevo, journalist Aida Fazlic. Welcome to our program, Aida.
Thank you, Osama. It's nice to be with you again.
You're welcome. Aida, when we talk about the freedom of the press and the freedom of speech, we talk about one aspect of journalism because it's much beyond that. It's much beyond a profession. It could be a way of living and lifestyle, as you say. Please.
Before answering your question, I would really like to underline that journalism is really a way of living, a lifestyle. And to all those young people who want to become journalists, just say that when I started studying and working, what I'm doing now, is not what I imagined I would be doing. Because back then, almost 20 years ago, I was thinking only about the great media conferences happening, covering stories, traveling all around the world, meeting important people, meeting other journalists, learning new things, learning places, people. Um, it wasn't much of my impression that we would actually so often face problems, especially when it comes to freedom of speech and freedom of press. Freedom of the press or freedom of the media is the fundamental principle that communication and expression through various media. So these two issues are the most important for any journalist all around the world. And I believe that no matter where in the world you work as a journalist, you have to have the opportunity to tell your story right, to cover it, to be there, and not to be just pushed away or your rights being violated. Um, it, it's very, very important. Every day we see different reports from one single happening in the world. And why is it like that, you ask yourself? Simply because some media are just not independent. They don't have the freedom of speech. Uh, for example, I do, or you maybe do, but they're being financed and controlled by their government and authorities. So they're not independent media. And the independent media are trying to show the freedom of speech and to show the story as they see it. So it's always that you have to check everything twice, sometimes even 3 or 4 times before you publish your story, especially when it comes to investigative journalism. I have to say that many of my colleagues have been facing pressure, attacks. I was myself once verbally attacked during some protests in our country, simply because the protester didn't like journalists, because he was thinking that most of the journalists are not covering the protest he thought we should be covering like that. But thank God, I had the opportunity to do my story right. And thank God I had the police on the protest who were like in a minute at the place where it all happened. So it's very important. And I think that the press freedom should be in every country's constitution written with big letters because it's very important.
Yes, Ada. Here, journalists may be in different countries around the world may face some violations, some restrictions by the authorities of their countries, like affecting their freedom of speech and the freedom of opinion. But when we talk about the Palestinian context, we talk more than that. We talk about the violation of the right to life. As I said in my introduction, 57 Palestinian journalists were killed by Israeli forces since 2002. As a European journalist now, how do you see such situation from afar?
From afar, I see it that the things you and your colleagues go through right now and for years in Palestine, that's just not the way it should not be. Our country is in the Balkans. Actually, it's the heart-shaped country in the heart of Europe. And we went through a horrible war from 1992 till 1995. So I know what you're going through and I can understand what you're facing. I have been talking to colleagues, to female colleagues who were covering the war here in Bosnia. They were on the front line, and I know what they told me, how it was for them. My very close friend and colleague I worked with, he went to Palestine a few times, and I know that he told me the last time he almost got jailed. The things you face, it's like you just don't have to be only prepared for covering stories. You have to be prepared for getting jailed, for getting even killed, and you are facing various violations of your human rights, not just journalist rights.
Yeah.
And I think that's just not the way it should be. Journalists should not be victims of war, and journalists should have the right to speak, to do their job, to walk free around, to have access to places other people don't. So you have to tell what's going on. And that is just not what is happening now in Palestine. And I think that is a very serious situation.
Yeah, and also the Palestinian journalists could be victimized and re-victimized again and again. And we all saw how the iconic Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh was killed by an Israeli sniper, and her funeral procession was attacked by the Israeli police in occupied Jerusalem. And until now, Israel still denies its commission of this crime, though many international newspapers, the Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, all these American outlets made their investigation and proved to a certain extent that Israel is the killer. The Palestinian forensic examination of the body of Shireen proved 100% that Shireen was killed by an Israeli sniper, by an Israeli bullet. So as journalists around the world, what should we do together in order to achieve justice to the victim, Shireen, and to her family?
Unfortunately, as you said, Shireen paid the biggest price. She lost her life for press freedom. She was on her task, doing nothing wrong, just covering a story. And I know Shireen was working for Al Jazeera, and I know that they are having training programs for all their journalists who are covering stories from crisis or conflict places. So I'm sure she went through a well training and she was aware of the situation, and I'm sure she wasn't violating any law. She was just doing her job. I saw today that even the Committee to Protect Journalists, a non-profit press freedom advocacy organization, has called the U.S. Biden administration to lead a true, independent, and, as they said, a transparent investigation into the killing of Palestinian-American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. I'm very worried about the situation and things that are happening over there still for years. And I think that it is about high time that journalists from all over the world actually gather in maybe one big organization just to say that we know our rights, we want our rights. Yesterday it was Shireen, today or tomorrow it can be me or you or any one of our colleagues. Um, we now have to be Shireen's voice. We have now mobile phones. We have mobile phones with cameras, which is very important. We have technology which is following us and giving us the opportunity to use it, and we have to use it the right way. We have to say that it's not fair that journalists are being killed who are the voice of victims, the voice of political happenings, the voice of economical movements. It's just important for us to be there, to do our job. So I think we should all start showing our support for you, for the journalists in Palestine, to show the world what is really going on.
Yes, my final question to you, Ida, is concerning the international double standard policy when it comes to human rights and justice. Of course, we are against the occupation of any country, and we refuse any nation to suffer. All people around the world are entitled to live good and decent life. But we see how international press forums, conferences focus on Ukraine and Ukraine journalists, while little attention is given to Palestine, if at all. So how do you see this double standard policy, and what is our role as journalists around the world to resist that?
We had the opportunity to be at such a big conference together, and this conference was really having too much talk about the Ukrainian-Russian conflict now. But I think it's mainly because it's the most recent one. And I remember someone saying, you know, Ukraine is almost Europe. It's a part of Europe. So Europe has to help. I mean, my country is in the heart of Europe, and we were during our war. But we didn't get that much help during our war as Ukraine is getting now. We didn't win the Eurovision Song Contest back then, during the 90s, as Ukraine did now. We didn't, we are struggling for years to become a European Union member state, but we still didn't make it. And they got an status over the night. It's just not the way it should be. It's the same with Palestine. You're struggling for peace for years. You're having so many things to show. But I also remember that we had the opportunity to listen to a professor who was analyzing the whole situation and Zelensky's public speeches, announcements, etc. I have to say that they are using a very powerful, we could say, journalistical weapon, and that is social media. We see that President Zelensky uses social media platforms to get attention. He obviously has a big team who is working behind them, giving him the right advice when to speak and what to say, in which specific moment. So they're carefully selecting pictures of children, of women, of people suffering, and posting it just to get empathy. And I kind of missed more reports on social media anywhere else, because social media today means you get to a huge publicum, to a huge audience all over the world. It's not just thousands of people, it's now millions of people. So we have to know that social media is a big instrument we have to use. And maybe that is something we should copy, especially you from Palestine, to choose specific pictures, footages of happenings, and to post them not only on YouTube and not only show them on your program, but also to share the stories on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, anywhere you can imagine, just to get more attention to show what was going on.
Aida Fazi, journalist from Sarajevo. It was a great honor having you on our program. Thank you.
It was my honor being your guest.
And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching. And from me, Osama Nazal, wish you a nice time.